I mean, this is the strangest time in my adult life when I see what's happening with the weakening of Iran and the fall of Assad. And so my big question for you kind of starting is, why should the average person in Bethesda, Maryland, in Indianapolis, and wherever in the world even care about a country like Israel? What do you feel the role of Israel is, and why should anybody care?
Well, frankly, I see Israel like um, Ukraine, like Taiwan, like India, really being on the front line for the defense of Western civilization and the post-World War II liberal order. And when we talk about many of these vacuums of leadership and control opening up in Syria and elsewhere in the world, what the average American needs to understand is that when you have a vacuum, it's seldom the forces of altruism which fill it. Rather, it's retrograde ideologies like the Russians or the Communist Chinese, or in the Middle East, you have the Islamic State or the Islamic Republic of Iran. And therefore, I would argue that neither the United States nor Israel actually have the ability to simply sit on their hands and see what happens. We know that the results aren't going to be good if we act disinterested.
So Israel sort of being the tip of the sphere of the spear, rather. Let me say
Or
that
the
again.
canary in the coal mine.
Israel's the canary in the coal mine, right? So you fear, or let me ask it this way: do you have a concern that we didn't have an Israel, a democratic ally in the Middle East? What would the Middle East look like to you?
Well, honestly, if we didn't have an Israel, a democratic ally in the Middle East, I think the Middle East would look much the same as it does now. And the reason I say that is this. When we look at Israel and when we look at the terrorism it faces, many academics and almost all diplomats like to interpret terrorism through the lens of grievance. And that can actually be comforting because if terrorism is caused by occupation or poverty or lack of employment opportunities, then you can come up with some diplomatic magic solution, some formula, and make it all go away. But the reason why I said, Jennifer, that it would look much the same as it looks now is in 1946. Yep. First of all, just let me back up. You know, I'm a historian by training, so I get paid to predict the past.
Yes,
My
I
critics would say I only get that right half the time. But in 1946, the Intelligence Office of the Department of War, which was the predecessor of our own Defense Intelligence Agency, was charged now that the Nazism, fascism, and the German and the Japanese army have been defeated, with determining what the greatest over-the-horizon threats to American national security would be. And they came up with two. One was communism, which was a give me given that the Cold War had really just erupted with the Azerbaijan crisis. And the second was radical Islamism. Now, what they were looking at was what the Muslim Brotherhood was doing in Egypt. The core of the Muslim Brotherhood was this notion that the reason why Islam appeared to be so much weaker than, for example, the European states was, according to Muslim Brotherhood ideologues, because we, the Muslim lands, have been too polluted by Western liberalism. And remember, the Egyptian constitution, the Egyptian laws were based on the Belgians, on the French. And so the Muslim Brotherhood had started whacking the Egyptian prime minister, different cabinet ministers, and so forth. The point of this is that 1946 was a year before the partition of Palestine and 2 years before the creation of the State of Israel. And therefore, it simply is false to assume that the reason why there's instability and conflict in the Middle East is because of the presence of the Jewish state itself. Frankly, I would say it's the opposite. Israel and the states which have aligned with it, most recently with the Abraham Accords, have really become an anchor for stability in an otherwise chaotic region. And I go back to this notion that when you have a vacuum, it's not the forces of altruism which fill it. And therefore, it behooves Israel and the moderate Arab bloc to try to fill that vacuum before the ideological based terrorists can.
That's an interesting jumping off point to talk about Turkey and the fall of Assad in Syria, and what does that, how does that, like, for the average person, again, how does that affect the Middle East, and what does that do to sort of the emerging possible addition of Saudi Arabia to the Abraham Accord, and how do we negotiate this situation with Turkey being a NATO member? Like, can you boil this down in sort of very simple, direct terms? Like, what exactly does the role of Turkey have now in the new Middle East?
Well, sure. Jennifer, if you want to understand how much Turkey has changed, let me cite a statistic that actually comes from Turkey's own interior ministry. Since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in Turkey more than 20 years ago, the murder rate of women inside Turkey has increased 1,400%. And again, that number has been reported by Voice of America. It has its roots in Turkey's own interior ministry. The point of this is it indicates just how much Turkey has transformed as it's become religiously conservative, and as the more religious conservatives have determined that, for example, they can perpetrate honor crimes without fear of accountability, without fear of the law. That's only a point of illustration. Now, to answer your question, before I talked about how diplomats like to see the world in terms of grievance, because they can address grievance. The problem is not everything is motivated by grievance. Sometimes ideology comes into play. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has an ideology which is evolved from the Muslim Brotherhood. He has an ideology which sees, much like Vladimir Putin sees the downfall of the Soviet Union as a great historical tragedy, Erdogan sees the fall of the Ottoman Empire as a tragedy. So this is oftentimes called neo-Ottomanism. The problem is, as Erdogan tries to export his brand of Islam for his ideological reasons, and as he tries to reconstitute in one way or another the Ottoman Empire, he forgets that the subject peoples of the Ottoman Empire have a much different memory of what that Ottoman Empire was than the conquerors who were based in Turkey. And so this is the core of a lot of the resistance between Erdogan and Turkey, and not just Israel, but as you said, states like Saudi Arabia itself. But here's my other problem with the United States, where on one hand, we remain blind to ideology. It's a no-brainer among both Democratic and Republican administrations. We stand against the extremism coming from the Middle East. But too often we see that extremism just in terms of the Iranian flavor, the so-called axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis. The problem is extremism can come in different flavors. And Turkey is now the chief engine of this other flavor of a Sunni-based extremism. Now, the enemy of our enemy isn't necessarily our friend. And so just because we want to defeat Iran's export of its ideology doesn't mean that Turkey's ideology is any more peaceful at this point. Again, I circle back to the State Department then. One problem we have in the United States is there's two problems. One
Only two?
well, only two for the sake of the brevity of this podcast. So let me say that too often in the State Department, we want to calibrate our policy to a way a country used to be rather than the way it is now. And so what we need to do is not engage in the wishful thinking and base our national security on that. When we have Turkey saying that they want to use military force to end Israel, to reconquer Jerusalem, when it's coming not only from the head of the parliament, but from the president and the president's son, we have to assume that's right. And while some people say, hey, the problem is only Recep Tayyip Erdogan, this guy who's dominated Turkey for 20 years. More than 35 million Turks have gone through the education system under him. And when you have that sort of incitement, even if Erdogan goes away tomorrow, you're not going to be able to erase that incitement. I mean, simply put, Turkey today for the 21st century is what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century in terms of the spread of radicalization and the promotion, the catalyst, the facilitation of anti-Semitism.
So I want to go back. I need to unpack all of what you just said here. But one question that I have is: so you feel that the movement of Turkey into Syria, propping up Syria, right, is about ideology and not so much about petro money and oil and connecting with Qatar and building um, a new axis of evil, if you will, a
The
Turkey
answer is
Qatar.
yes.
Okay.
I mean, I'd say basically the answer is yes. The way to think about Turkey, I mean, first of all, Syria doesn't really have that much oil. Most of the oil it has is for domestic consumption. But what we see with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which many people just say HTS, this former al-Qaeda group, which Turkey has backed and which has steamrolled through Turkey, through Syria, taken over the country. HTS
I'm
is
sorry.
to Turkey.
I think I read that, and this, correct me if I'm wrong, that the U.S. has a $10 million bounty on his head. Is that right?
The United States had a $10 million bounty on Ahmed al-Shada, or his nom de guerre was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, who was the head of HTS. We have removed that bounty. And again, that's the prioritization of wishful thinking over reality.
Who removed the bounty? Who
The
did?
US State Department.
Under the Biden administration.
Under the Biden administration, just in the last week, Assistant Secretary of State Barbara Leaf went to Damascus, met with him, and lifted or at least suspended the bounty. It's really
That's really interesting that they would do that, and also, when they came into office, lift the Houthis from being
exactly.
a terrorist country. What would be the motivation of a Biden administration to immediately make friends with the new supposed leader of Syria?
I
What's the
think it's
rationale?
naivete. Honestly, Jennifer, I think it's naivete. It may be wanting to claim credit, although then they will deny responsibility when it turns bad. Because remember, a reformed Al Qaeda group isn't a democracy. A reformed Al Qaeda group is a group that only tortures Christians to death rather than simply beheads them. The
And
other
the
thing to keep,
Kurds. What about the Kurds?
oh yeah, but look, the other thing first with regard to the recognition and the delisting of the head of the HTS, remember that there's going to be about a $7 billion United Nations program to rebuild Syria after these years of civil war. And that money traditionally gets channeled through the government. So if we rush recognition of HTS as the government of Syria, we are giving them access and decision making ability over how that $7 billion is going to be spent. So would you really want to trust that they're truly reformed after just 1 week of rhetoric?
So what's going on there? Michael, boil this down for the average listener. Why would a Biden administration, and I think you said it beautifully, that he sees the world, or whoever's running the administration, it's certainly not him, but he sees the world the way he wishes to see it, and not at all how it is in reality. Who would make that kind of strategic change after overthrowing a government 7 days later and rushing that kind of money to them? There's got to be another
Okay.
reason, something else
I
at
mean,
play.
I disagree with the logic, but I
Okay.
believe the logic of Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, would be that if we have our foot in the door, then maybe we can influence people by talking to them. And that tends to be the underlying philosophy of most of our diplomats. It never hurts to talk. The problem is sometimes it does. And what many of our diplomats don't realize is the legitimacy we bestow upon some of our adversaries by having discussions with them. And in this case, that comes with, as we said, access to a $7 billion pot.
So what does this okay, so let's put a pin in that for a minute, because we see I want to tie this back into Israel, because we see Israel has now taken the other side of the Golan Heights, and has a buffer zone. What does a Donald Trump presidency do? He comes in January 20th, 2025, and there is a huge raging fire, a huge mess in the Middle East. And I think we would agree. Would you agree? Let me ask, would you agree that he wants to resurrect the Abraham Accords and bring Saudi in and start to stabilize the Middle East? I mean, that would be a natural
Yes,
yes.
I absolutely agree with you on that. He's willing to break diplomatic China to negotiate with people that others wouldn't negotiate with, but unlike many diplomats. So we saw this, for example, with North Korea in the last administration, the last Trump administration. Unlike other diplomats, however, he'll see if there's a willingness. And if there's not, he's not afraid to walk away. And that itself can be a strength that many of our diplomats have lost touch with, a willingness to walk away, a willingness to say, if you're not interested, fine, we're not going to keep begging you. A willingness or recognition that for many of our adversaries, they look at diplomacy as an asymmetric warfare strategy. They're more interested in gathering concessions through a process than ever really making a peace. And so I do believe that Trump is cognizant of that.
Will his first, do you feel Trump's first move will be in the Middle East? Now, let me say it differently. Trump comes in January 20th. What do you think his first strategic move is in the Middle East, given Hamas has our hostages, given, multi-front war, given a weakened
Yeah,
Iran, and now the Houthis shooting missiles into Tel Aviv and other places almost every night?
yeah. Okay, first of all, we're going to see a return of maximum pressure. It will take a little while to work. It's arrogant to believe that all strategies need to work according to the American political calendar. And what didn't really make the headlines is 2 days after Trump beat Kamala Harris, the Biden administration unfroze $10 billion worth of Iranian assets. Now, what Trump is going to do, Trump does not, and I think we can all agree, Trump does not want American boots on the ground. He doesn't believe that the American military should take on the role of the security of European states, or for that matter, Israel. But unlike the Biden administration and previous administrations, Trump isn't going to interfere. If Israel is willing to defend itself, Trump will likely provide Israel with the means to defend itself. And if that
Not continue to slow walk the um, much needed tanks and artillery and stuff, and just what the Biden administration has done to Israel over the last year and plus.
right. I mean, Israel's doing what Trump wants, which is taking responsibility for itself. And so perhaps Israel that will then become the model for the Trump doctrine. And that same model can apply to Poland or to Taiwan, or perhaps even to Ukraine if Vladimir Putin, Trump decides, isn't negotiating in good faith.
And how does that look? I mean, we can spill over into Ukraine and that war, but going back to Israel, so Trump would essentially um, expedite and fast track all military equipment, all aid, intelligence, all the things that Israel would need to be successful to take out the Houthis like they are right now. I mean, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, but I'm not simply talking about the Houthis. I'm also talking about the Iraqis and so forth. And you know what? The threat of Donald Trump coming back into power is what has led the Iraqis and Prime Minister Soudani in Iraq to be really restrained. In all this recent chaos, when we've had Houthi missiles flying, when we've had Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, when we've had Hezbollah, you haven't heard a lot about the Iraqis actually launching things at Israel. There may have been one or two cases, but the Iraqi government has stayed on top of it, which is also a positive manifestation of the Trump doctrine, because the Iraqi government knows that they are going to be held responsible for what happens. None of this good cop, bad cop crap, and none of this, we're not accountable for what happens within our own territory nonsense. The Iraqis get it, and that's a positive sign that perhaps Trump's no nonsense approach, mixed with his lack of predictability, may actually work.
I'm optimistic. I don't think it could be any worse than what we have now. And I think he did an amazing job in the Middle East in particular. I want to talk for a minute about Jordan. Because it seems like Jordan could be concerned, being the Hashemite rulers with so many Palestinians. I mean, is there a concern that government could be overthrown?
I certainly have a concern. I worry much more about Jordan now than I do about Israel and the ability of Jordan to survive this mess. Because remember, King Abdullah II, the Hashemite king of Jordan, and the Hashemite just means he traces his descent back to the family of the Prophet Muhammad. So the king of Jordan is very, very popular outside his own country. It's sort of like Mikhail Gorbachev was in the Soviet Union. That what many Americans forget, though, is that popularity outside his country is not matched by popularity inside Jordan. Inside Jordan, people don't particularly like the king. He's seen as corrupt. His wife is seen as a profligate spender. And as you say, 70% of Jordan is actually Palestinian. Now, you've got a situation where Hamas, or at least Hamas leaders, seem to have been kicked out of Qatar, and they've relocated to Turkey. But Turkey may not want them to stay in Turkey, because if Turkey can push them into Syria, it's sort of like Hezbollah with Iran again. They can Turkey can have the plausible deniability, but at the same time escape the accountability. So if Hamas, and I mean, if Hamas, and Hamas are Arabs, Turks are not Arabs, if Hamas as Arabs go into Syria, they can incite not only the Hamas in the Gaza Strip and not only the Palestinians in the West Bank, but also the Palestinians in Jordan itself. And when you want to go back to October 7th, 2023, a lot of people would say, oh, that date was chosen because it was a Jewish holiday, or that date was chosen because it was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. But there was something else going on there. Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, is 88 years old. He's in the 20th year of his 4-year presidential term.
Yeah.
He's a chain smoker. And unlike Yasser Arafat before him, he hasn't appointed a successor. So when we saw Hamas use this great violence, the single daily greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, what Hamas was trying to do was seize leadership of the Palestinians ahead of Mahmoud Abbas's death. Now, with Hamas coming from the other direction, they're thinking they can win the trifecta. They can win not only the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but Jordan itself. And that really is the danger that's looming. And you know what? The king's wife, the king's wife, when she came to Congress just about a year ago, she was all pro-Hamas. She was all populist. She was a moral coward. And the fact that she was in Congress saying that Israel was committing quote unquote genocide and we needed to do more for Hamas really kneecaps the ability of the Jordanian monarchy to ask for assistance once Hamas comes after it.
So let me just see. So you think if Hamas were to be successful grabbing the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Syria, and taking over Jordan, is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not. I'm saying they would use Syria as plausible deniability. They would use it as a base, like they're using Qatar now.
Got it. Oh, I see. I see. Okay. Well,
I mean,
it
Look,
seems
Syria has been before listed by the State Department as a state sponsor of terrorism for a reason. I mean, they were hosting all numbers of terrorist groups. Just because Bashar al-Assad is gone doesn't mean they're going to stop. They may just change the flavor of the terrorist groups which they support.
which is why Israel has gone in very aggressively, blowing up their naval ships uh,
Going after the chemical weapons
and the
stockpiles. Yeah.
chemical weapons depots and anything else they can get their hand on. Do you think there's a back channel going on between the Trump people and Bibi Netanyahu's government, trying to figure out strategically where to take out as best they can proactively anything that may be left in Syria?
Look, I can't speak to the contents of the discussions, and I certainly am not part of those discussions, but I would say there's more than a back channel. I mean, simply because Trump has been on the phone with Bibi Netanyahu, and frankly, Trump has been on the phone, I know specifically with the Iraqi prime minister, and with others. Trump isn't making a secret of his phone calls with foreign leaders, and one would presume when they speak They know Trump. Trump, frankly, was more um, Trump was more popular than Kamala Harris, both in the Middle East, including among the Arab states, and also in Africa. But we can put that aside for now. Then was Kamala Harris. And they're talking to Trump as someone they know and they've done business with, rather than simply the pleasantries that may have engaged a normal sort of phone call at this point in time. Basically, the difference between Trump version 1.0 and Trump version 2.0, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, is that Trump is going to hit the ground running, number one, because it's not going to take so long to get his own team in place because they don't need to go back as far for security clearances. And number two, Trump understands how the levers of power work in Washington. He doesn't need to reinvent the wheel.
And you see that Israel under a Trump administration could be a major regional power in the Middle East? That's a question, actually. Do
Look,
you
I
see
mean,
that?
I don't know whether it's going to be a major regional power. I would settle just for a major regional fact of life, which everyone accepts. And this goes for the future of the Palestinians as well. Look, I think it's naive to think there's going to be a democracy among the Palestinians. I would settle for a dictatorship post Hamas, a dictatorship maybe like Egypt's dictatorship under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. That is a dictatorship, but at least one that's not dedicated to killing Jews. If we can have that as a first step, then the Middle East can truly advance. People can start turning towards business, towards integration, and we can put the tragedy of the last decades of needless war behind us.
I want to go back to my first question with you. Why should someone in Phoenix, Arizona, or Helsinki, Finland care about Israel? I know you said they're the tip of the spear. Given all the headlines, and what would you say in a sentence why it is absolutely imperative that Israel be strong and thrive in 2025 and beyond?
Let me end this then by quoting Osama bin Laden.
Oh
Osama bin
God.
Laden said, "Everybody likes the strong horse. If you depict yourself as weak, if you're constantly begging for peace, then ultimately you're only going to encourage more war." We've had any number of US presidents who have tried to remove the United States from the Middle East, only to have to come back as things got worse. The only antidote to this is to defeat terrorism 100%, to have Israeli victory. Like like the United States had victory over Germany and Japan over World War II. We've got to stop snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And when that happens, we can rebuild a much better region, one in which peoples can live together. I mean, ultimately, however, if the Palestinians learn the lesson, they are always going to be bailed out and that there's no accountability for their genocidal ideology, well, then ultimately we're going to be back there for years to come.
Michael Rubin, American Enterprise Institute, thank you so much for spending your morning with me. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.